Welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 has been divided up into 3 parts, all of which will cover the skeleton. Part 1, we will focus on the skull. We will do a brief review of the skeletal system as well as the 2 major divisions of the skeleton, but for the most part we will be focusing solely on the skull. In Chapter 1, we introduced 11 body systems, or 11 organ systems. By definition, an organ system will include several different structures and organs which come together to serve a common function or common functions. The skeletal system was one that we introduced, and we saw that it included bones, cartilage, tendons, ligaments, and joints. And we know that similar to the regions of the body, the skeleton can be divided into 2 major divisions. Those divisions being the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton includes. This diagram here outlines the 2 major regions of the skeleton. In blue, you have the axial skeleton forming the longitudinal axis of the body, which includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the thoracic cage. In tan, you find the appendicular skeleton, which includes the bones of both the upper and lower limbs, as well as the pectoral and pelvic girdles. The girdles are responsible for attaching the upper and lower limbs to the axial skeleton. The skull can be divided into 2 sets of bones, the first being the cranium, which is responsible for enclosing the cranial cavity and the brain. The other set includes the facial bones. So you could think of the cranium as the forehead, the top of the head, the lateral sides, as well as the back, with the facial bones making up the face, or the anterior aspect of the head. On this slide, you are able to see a lateral view of the entire skull, with the bones of the cranium and the facial bones separated from one another. Again, the cranium is responsible for protecting the brain. It includes your forehead, the top of the head, the sides, and the back. The facial bones, including the facial framework, we will see that the facial bones offer openings for food and air. They secure your teeth, and they also house special organs such as the tongue, the eyes, and the nasal cavity. For the next bit of this lecture, we are going to focus solely on the cranium. There are 8 cranial bones total. We have the frontal bone, 2 parietal bones, a left and a right side, an occipital bone, 2 temporal bones, again a left and a right, the sphenoid bone, and the ethmoid bone. Now for each of these bones, I will provide you with a list of bone markings. Not only should you be able to identify these on the skull, but you also need to know what bone each bone marking is found on, as well as a little bit about that bone marking. The first bone that we will talk about is on this slide here. You're able to see an anterior view of the skull as well as a view from the top of the head with the top of the skull removed. The frontal bone is everything in yellow. I'll go ahead and outline it with the laser right now. Again, the frontal bone creates the forehead. But a few things that you need to be able to identify. The first is the supraorbital margin, and that is the ridge of bone creating the top of the eye socket just deep to the eyebrow. Along the supraorbital margin, you find an opening, potentially a notch, depends on the individual. Those are the supraorbital foramen, which allow for the passage of nerves and blood vessels. Lastly, the glabella is that region of the frontal bone situated in between the supraorbital margins. On this image over here, you don't see too many of the bone markings that I just described. However, you are able to see the full extent of the frontal bone. The next bone that we'll talk about associated with the cranium will be the left and right parietal bones. The parietal bones are found on the most superior aspect of the skull or the top of your head. While there are no bone markings that you need to be able to identify on the parietal bone, we do have to bring up what is known as a suture. And we will see in Chapter 8, a suture is a type of joint or articulation between two or more bones. These joints within the skull, we will see that they allow skull bones to come together. And they are, for the most part, immovable joints. There are 4 that you need to be able to identify. All 4 of them allow for the articulation between a parietal bone or the parietal bones and another cranial bone. The first is the coronal suture, found in the coronal plane, articulates the left and right parietal bones with the frontal bone. The sagittal suture in the sagittal plane is found in between the left and right parietal bones. The lambdoid suture now found on the posterior aspect of the skull between the left and right parietal bones and the occipital bone. And lastly, the left and right squamous sutures, there's one on each side, between a corresponding parietal bone and the temporal bones. This image here again, while it shows you the cranial bones versus the facial bones, we are also able to identify several of the sutures on the skull. The first is the coronal suture now. So if you follow the laser pointer, the coronal suture running in the coronal or frontal plane will allow for the articulation between the left and right parietal bones with the frontal bone. Also seen on this view is the lambdoid suture, and this spans the entire length or width of the back of the head. The lambdoid suture allows for the articulation between the left and right parietal bones with the occipital bone. And lastly, we are able to see one of the squamous sutures here found between the right parietal bone and the right temporal bone. Looking now at a posterior view of the skull, the parietal bones, both left and right, are seen here in that pink-red color. But from this view, we are able to identify the sagittal suture, which is the articulation between the 2 parietal bones found in the sagittal plane. We are also able to have a better view of the entire lambdoid suture found in between the left and right parietal bone and the occipital bone. Now looking at a lateral view of the right side of the skull, again we are able to see the squamous suture in between the parietal bone and the temporal bone in orange, the coronal suture between the parietal bone and the frontal bone in yellow, and the lambdoid suture between the parietal and occipital bone. Next, we will move on to the occipital bone, and if you remember where the occipital region is in the body, it is the back of the head. The occipital bone makes up the posterior aspect of the skull, and as we've seen, it does articulate with both parietal bones, but also with the temporal bones on both sides and the sphenoid bone. There are 4 bone markings that you need to be able to identify, understand that they're found on the occipital bone, and also understand a brief description of each. First is the foramen magnum, which translates to large opening. Next we have the occipital condyles. Again, a condyle is a rounded bump or protrusion. The hypoglossal canal. A canal is an opening in the bone. In EXS217, you will see that the hypoglossal canal allows for the passage of a nerve. And lastly, the external occipital protuberance will be a bump on the occipital bone on the external surface or the outside. Looking at a posterior view of the skull again, the occipital bone is seen here in brown. One thing that you are able to identify from the posterior view is the external occipital protuberance. If you actually take your hand or your fingers and palpate the back of your head, you are able to feel this bump. This is an important landmark as it allows for the attachment of a muscle known as the trapezius muscle. Now looking at an inferior view of the skull, again, the occipital bone is everything in brown. But from this view, you are able to identify the foramen magnum. This is an important landmark because it allows for the nervous system, like the brain and spinal cord, to enter and exit the skull. Flanking the anterior aspect of the foramen magnum, you find the occipital condyles, these rounded bumps. These two bumps will articulate with the vertebral column. And lastly, you have the hypoglossal canals, which are found on the medial aspect of the condyles. The hypoglossal canals allow for the passage of a nerve. The next bone that we will cover, or bones rather, will be the left and right temporal bones. The temporal bones, think of the temple of your skull. The temporal bones help to form the lateral walls of the cranium. Each temporal bone has 3 distinct regions. While you will not be tested on the regions, you do need to know all of the bone markings found on the temporal bone. The first couple ones, we have the zygomatic processes. On the next slide, you'll be able to see this, but the zygomatic processes help to form your cheekbone. Next, we have the mandibular fossa. We know that a fossa is a depression. This is found on the inferior aspect of the skull and actually articulates with the mandible to form the temporomandibular joint, or the TMJ. Next, the external acoustic meatus. This will be an opening on the outside of the skull. Think of this as where your ear attaches. It is also where you stick a Q-tip. We have the jugular foramen, which allows for the passage of the jugular vein, the carotid canal, which allows for the internal carotid artery to enter the skull to supply the brain with blood. Foramen lacerum. When you hear lacerum, you should think lacerate. So nothing passes through this opening as it is covered with cartilage and connective tissue. The internal acoustic meatus now will be found on the inside aspect of the skull. The stylomastoid foramen will be a very tiny opening found in between the styloid and mastoid processes. Again, we have a lateral view of the skull, but now everything in orange will be the temporal bone, again forming the lateral sides of the cranium. The first bone marking that you had was the zygomatic process, which is this skinny extension of bone here contributing to the cheekbone. Next, we had the mandibular fossa, which is best seen from an inferior view. After that, we have the external acoustic meatus. This is where your ear attaches. It allows for the passage of sound waves to enter the inner ear. Also seen from this view, 2 of the processes from that list. If you take your fingers or your hand and palpate your skull posterior to your ear, you feel a rounded bump. That is the mastoid process. Deeper, you find the styloid process. It's much more pointy, like a stylus or a pen. This one is not as easily as palpated, so maybe don't go looking for it. Looking at an inferior view of the skull now, again, both temporal bones are seen in orange. From this view, you are able to see the zygomatic process, helping to form that arch that is the cheekbone. Posterior to the zygomatic process, you find the mandibular fossa, which is a depression that accepts the mandible to form the TMJ. From this view, you can't see the mastoid and styloid processes as well, but you are able to identify the very small opening in between the two, hence the name stylomastoid foramen. But also from this view, you can see many of the important foramina or openings on the base of the skull, such as the jugular foramen, the carotid canal, and foramen lacerum. Now we are looking at a superior view, so if you are looking down on someone's head with the top of the head and the brain removed. Again, everything in orange is the temporal bone. From this view now, you are still able to see the jugular foramen, and you are also able to identify the internal acoustic meatus. We have two more bones to talk about with the cranium. The sphenoid bone we'll start with, and then we'll finish up with the ethmoid bone. The sphenoid bone you could think of as the keystone of the skull. It articulates to many of the skull bones, and if you were to take it apart, the sphenoid bone would appear to look like a bat. Similar to the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone has a sinus, but several bone markings that you absolutely need to be able to identify and understand that they belong to the sphenoid bone include the sella turcica, which translates to Turkish saddle, the hypophyseal fossa, the greater and lesser wings, optic canals, superior orbital fissure, and three foramina, ovale, rotundum, and spinosum. Here is a picture of the sphenoid bone disarticulated from the skull. You will not be given a picture of this to identify, but you are able to see all of the bone markings on the sphenoid bone on this slide. This is a slide that you should be familiar with by now. The last bone of the cranium, or the cranial set of bones of the skull, is the ethmoid bone. Four things that you need to be able to identify: the cribiform plate, the crista galli, perpendicular plate, and superior and middle nasal concha. Similar to the sphenoid bone, you will not be given a picture of a disarticulated ethmoid bone, but you are able to see where it is found in the skull. So it's deep in the skull, posterior, and sort of situated in between the eye sockets. Now from this view, the ethmoid bone is seen here in orange, and there will be a better view of it on the next slide. But from this view, you are able to see the perpendicular plate. The perpendicular plate helps to form the nasal septum. It's a wall that splits the nasal cavity in half. Just adjacent to the perpendicular plate, you see the middle nasal concha. The middle nasal concha help to form the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. Think of them as shelves. From this view now, again, a superior view with the brain and the top of the skull removed, we have the ethmoid bone kind of situated in the middle of the frontal bone. But if you can see all of those holes there in the bone, that's the cribiform plate. Those holes allow for the passage of nerves that communicate between the brain and the nasal cavity. They detect smell. In between the cribiform plates, we have a superior projection known as the crista galli. The crista galli is going to anchor a sheet of dense connective tissue which covers the brain to further protect it. We're going to finish up this lecture by talking about the other part of the skull, which includes the facial bones, or the facial framework found on the anterior face or the anterior head. We have 14 bones total. 12 of them are paired, so there's a left and a right. The first is the mandible, or the lower jaw. Next, we have two maxillary bones, the upper jaw, two zygomatic bones. Those form the blunt of your cheekbone. Two nasal bones, which form the bridge of the nose, where your glasses sit. Two lacrimal bones, two palatine bones, the vomer, and two inferior nasal concha. The first facial bone that we will start with is the mandible, so your lower jaw. Overall, the mandible has two main parts, the body, which is the chin, as well as two upright rami. Think of these as your cheeks. Found on the mandible, again, we have many bone markings: the mandibular angle, the coronoid process, a condylar process, the mandibular notch, the alveolar process, and two foramina, the mandibular and mental foramen. Here is a lateral view of the mandible, or the lower jaw. Several bone markings that you need to identify, but first let's pick out the two major regions. Again, the body of the mandible creates the chin. That's the main part of the bone. And then we have these two upright projections, one on the right side and one on the left side. Those are the rami, or a mandibular ramus. The first bone marking that was on the list was the mandibular angle, which is found in between the ramus and the body. From there, we are going to have the coronoid process, which is more anterior. The coronoid process is separated from the condylar process by the mandibular notch. Again, a notch is like a groove out of a bone. This condylar process, though, is extremely important because it inserts into the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone to ultimately form the temporomandibular joint. Also seen on the mandible, we have the alveolar process, which are these superior projections of bone in between teeth. They are responsible for anchoring teeth into the lower jaw. Finishing up with the mandible, we have two foramina, or two openings. On the internal aspect of the ramus, we find the mandibular foramen. And then on the anterior aspect of the chin, we find the mental foramen. If you remember your body regions, the mental region was the chin. Those two openings are extremely important because there's a nerve that courses through them, which is what the dentist injects with Novocaine to numb that region of the body. Looking at an anterior view of the mandible now, seen here in a darker orange, you're able to see the body of the mandible, which forms the majority of the chin, as well as the left and right ramus. You can see the angle where the ramus meets the body. You are also able to see the mental foramen on the anterior aspect of the chin. Moving along, let's address the upper jaw now. Again, we have a left and a right maxillary bone that we just collectively call the maxilla. But when both of them come together, they form the upper jaw. Several different processes, some openings. First, we have the alveolar processes, which are the exact same thing that we saw on the mandible. They are used to anchor the teeth. The palatine process will help to form the anterior aspect of the hard palate, or the roof of your mouth. The frontal process will project up towards the frontal bone. The zygomatic processes will help to form the cheekbone. The maxillary sinus, this is the largest sinus in the skull. It is also the hardest to drain when it's full of mucus. The inferior orbital fissure. A fissure, again, is a slit-like opening. We have an infraorbital foramen. Remember, we had a supraorbital foramen on the frontal bone. And lastly, we have an incisive fossa, which will be found just posterior to your incisors or to behind your two front teeth. Here we have a picture of the right side of the maxilla, or the right maxillary bone. Not a great view and not something that I would test you on. However, you are able to see certain aspects of it, like the frontal process, which goes up the side of the nose towards the frontal bone, you are able to see the infraorbital foramen, or the opening below the orbit. This is a better view to study the maxilla, or the left and right maxillary bones. It is seen here in purple. So from this view, we can see the frontal process reaching up towards the frontal bone. We have the infraorbital foramen, or the openings below the eye. We also see alveolar processes, or those bony projections in between the teeth. From this view of the maxillary bone or bones, we are able to see the hard palate, or the palatine process of the maxilla. Again, the palatine process of the maxilla helps to form the anterior aspect of the hard palate, or the roof of your mouth. Situated in between the palatine processes, we find the incisive fossa. There's a nerve that exits the skull here to innervate, or to receive information from the roof of the mouth, like hot food, or maybe a tortilla chip that's rather crunchy or pointy. Other facial bones that are much smaller but are just as important. The zygomatic bones, there's a left and a right, which forms the majority of your cheekbone. The nasal bone forms the bridge of the nose. You should note that the tip of your nose is made up of hyaline cartilage, but the bridge is made up of bone, and that is where your glasses rest. And next we have the lacrimal bones. The term lacrimal means tear, and your tears will exit the medial corner of your eye, which is where we find the lacrimal bones. On this anterior view now, in darker blue, we find the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone will articulate with many zygomatic processes of other bones, like the maxilla and the frontal bone and the temporal bone, to form the entire cheekbone. We can also see the nasal bones in violet. And lastly, the lacrimal bone is seen here in green, in the medial corner of the eye socket. From this view, you are able to see the entire zygomatic bone, as well as the green lacrimal bone and the nasal bone. The last bit of the facial bones will include the palatine bones. The palatine bones will articulate with the palatine processes of the maxilla to complete the hard palate, or the roof of the mouth. The vomer is found in the nasal cavity. The vomer helps to form a part of the nasal septum. You need to know what two bones form the nasal septum, and they will be the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the vomer. Together, those two bones create a wall that will divide our nasal cavity in half. And lastly, the inferior nasal concha. Remember, the ethmoid bone had the superior and middle nasal concha. The inferior nasal concha is a separate bone, but it also contributes to the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. Looking again at the hard palate, we have this gray bone here, which is the palatine bone, articulating with the palatine process of the maxilla to complete the entire hard palate. Both of these images will show the nasal cavity as well as the nasal septum. In the image on the left here, in yellow, we will have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, which will articulate with the vomer in blue to form the nasal septum. The rest of that space is filled with cartilage. And then on the image on the right, in orange, we see the superior and middle nasal concha, which belong to the ethmoid bone. And then we have the inferior nasal concha in green, which is its own bone, but contributes to the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. One bone that we need to talk about that does not belong to the skull, doesn't belong to the vertebral column, and does not belong to the thoracic cage, but belongs to the axial skeleton is known as the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone contributes to the longitudinal axis of the body, and it is found in the anterior neck just inferior to the mandible or to the lower jaw. This is the only bone in the body that does not have any direct articulation with any other bone. It is simply held in place by tendons, ligaments, and muscles, and its purpose is to elevate and depress while swallowing and talking. Now we'll focus on paranasal sinuses for the last couple of slides in this lecture. You may have heard me mention them earlier, but overall there are 5 skull bones that contain a paranasal sinus: the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, and the left and right maxillary bones. I briefly mentioned that a sinus is there to lessen the weight of the skull, but also for sound resonance of the voice. When we hear ourselves talk, or when we listen to a recording, it sounds much different than what we hear as if we were just talking to a friend in conversation. And that has to do with sound resonance. Sinuses are also great for warming and humidifying the air. But that also comes into effect when we talk about sinus infections. So all of these sinuses or spaces are lined with mucus, and they are filled with air, so they are susceptible to infection. While you will not have to identify these on the skull, on the human, on your exam, you do have to know which bones have a sinus. But looking at this slide now, you are able to see that the frontal sinus is kind of situated near where we would find the glabella. The ethmoid sinus, more so down the bridge of the nose, followed by the sphenoid sinus, and the largest of all of them will be the maxillary sinuses. If you've ever had a sinus infection, you may feel pressure or pain along your cheekbones or maybe in your forehead, and that's because those are the largest sinuses, but also the hardest to drain or to clear out that infected mucus. To summarize, this was Chapter 7, Part 1. We introduced the skeletal system, the 2 parts or 2 major divisions of the skeleton, focused solely on the skull, which is just a part of the axial skeleton.